Okay, what is up there, YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on experimental Gras rifles of the 1870s, 80s, and 1890s. Now, the Gras rifle was a French bolt-action single-shot rifle produced from 1874 until about the mid-1880s, and it was actually designed as a replacement for the Franco-Prussian War-era French chest-pull rifle from the 1860s. Now, the Gras rifle fired a large 11mm cartridge, but there are also some versions that fired a 10.4mm cartridge. But during the later 1870s and early 1880s, the French military actually experimented with converting the Gras rifle into a magazine-fed rifle, bolt-action rifle. So here are some of the rare Gras variants that were produced, or experimental Gras prototypes that were produced in the 1870s and 80s. And the first rifle in this video is the Gras Vitality rifle from the mid-1870s. This was an experimental bolt-action rifle chambered in the 11 by 59mm rim cartridge, but it could also use the 10.4 by 47mm rim cartridge. This weapon used the Italian Waddell system, which was a tube magazine, and this magazine held between 5 and 8. And this was one of the first, if not the first, modification of the Gras rifle. And it is pretty strange, and there's not much history on this rifle. It was never used in any conflict, but it is an interesting experimental rifle. And the next Gras modification was the Gras Waddell rifle, or the Gras Waddell rifle designed between 1877 and 1880. This was a Gras rifle fused with the Austrian Waddell system. And now the Waddell rifle actually had a rear box magazine that could be placed on top, or a drop magazine that would allow you to fire the Gras rifle repeatedly instead of firing it in single shot mode like you would normally. And this weapon was also chambered for the standard 11 by 59mm cartridge, but it could also use the Austrian 11 by 58mm model 1877 cartridge. And this stack magazine, or this drop magazine, had a capacity of 10 rounds. And this overhead magazine gave this Gras rifle an increased rate of fire of between 10 and 15 rounds per minute, about as fast as many World War I era rifles. But this weapon was never adopted, but it is still an interesting rifle. And there were actually two other versions of this overhead magazine for the Gras Waddell rifle modification, or modification rifle. The next experimental rifle is the Gras Untitled Charger, and this was an experimental rotating bolt-action rifle designed during the same period of 1877 through 1880. Now, this rifle used a 5-round rotary magazine, very similar to later rotary magazines seen later on in the late 1880s and early 1890s. Now, this weapon was pretty advanced for its time. Imagine if the French military had adopted this version of the Gras Waddell rifle. Imagine if the French had this weapon during the First World War. Remember, during World War I, many old Gras rifles were taken out of storage in order to free up more modern Lebel and Berthier rifles during the First World War. So imagine if this was one of the weapons used in World War I, but unfortunately that never happened, and this weapon never made it past the prototype stage, but it is still an interesting weapon overall. The next one is a fusion of the French and American bolt-action systems, and that is the Gras Lee experimental bolt-action rifle from 1879-1880. And this was pretty much the Gras rifle fused with the American Winchester Lee bolt-action rifle that was designed in 1878/1879. You would remember that rifle as being one of the more advanced American rifles that was used in the early 1880s, and some of those I believe were used in the Spanish-American War. Now this rifle was chambered for the standard 11 by 59 millimeter rim cartridge, but there were some sources that state that it was chambered for the American .4570 government cartridge. Now you remember that was the same cartridge used in the Springfield trapdoor rifle, and it was a pretty powerful black powder cartridge. This weapon had a 5 to 6 round internal magazine, but sadly, like the other guns on this list, it never made it past the prototype stage. Which brings us to an even rarer version, and that is the Gras Robin Charger rifle from 1880/1885. And this was an overhead bolt-action magazine-fed rifle, chambered for the standard 11 by 59 millimeter Gras cartridge, and was fed by a 6-round top side magazine, as in the magazine was placed on the side. Now, unlike the Gras Waddell rifle, the first one, this magazine was permanently mounted to the side of the gun rather than being overhead. So this was kind of like the bolt-action equivalent of the Japanese Type 11 or the Danish Madison light machine gun, but in a bolt-action rifle instead of as a light machine gun. And this weapon also never made it past the prototype stage, but it is still an interesting piece of firearms history. And the next Gras modification rifle is actually even stranger, because I can't tell if this rifle is from France or from Poland. The Gras Spital Charger rifle from 1885 also. And this weapon was chambered for the 8 millimeter Lebel cartridge, which was the early semi-smokeless powder later used in the Lebel Model 1886 bolt-action rifle. And this weapon was also fitted with a 5 to 6 round internal magazine. But this weapon is either from Poland or was probably made by a Polish citizen living in France, and it was actually tested in the early to mid 1880s. This was also one of the rifles tested against the early Lebel prototype rifles, ultimately losing as the Lebel would become the standard French bolt-action rifle from 1886 onwards, until at least the introduction of the Berthier later on in 1892. But this rare Gras Niskowski rifle is pretty strange. It's pretty strange and also pretty rare, especially if this rifle was designed in Poland, which was part of the Russian Empire back in the 1880s. And then there is the Gras Potex Charger rifle from 1885 also. And this was also chambered in the newer 8 by 50 millimeter Lebel cartridge, later used as the standard ammunition in the Lebel Model 1886 rifle. And it was also fitted with a 5 or 6 round internal magazine. And this weapon was also tested against the Lebel Model 1886 prototypes in 1885. So this rifle is pretty rare. It was designed by the Potex company. You may remember them as the company who designed the main armament for the Renault FT-17 light tank from World War I. Yes, they also designed machine guns and rifles too, and this is one of the rare examples of that, the Gras Potex Charger rifle from 1885. And the final rifle on the list is actually my second favorite. I actually like the Gras Niskowski rifle more. The last rifle on the list is the Gras Spital Ski Charger from 1885 also. This was another experimental rotary magazine-fed bolt-action rifle, this time from 1885. It was also chambered in the 8x50mm rim Lebel cartridge and used in the Lebel model 1886, and she had an 8-round cylinder magazine. Now, the reason I like this rifle, it actually reminds me of the pre-production M1 Garand prototypes from the 1920s and 30s, and also the Johnson Model 1939 prototype semi-automatic rifle, except this is a bolt-action rifle from the 1880s. Now, this weapon also competed against the Lebel Model 1886 prototypes and eventually lost. The Lebel Model 1886 became the standard issued French bolt-action rifle of the later 19th century, staying in service all the way up until the Indochina War of the 1940s and 1950s. But this Gras Spital Ski Charger rifle is one of the rarer modifications to the old Gras Model 1874 rifle. And that's about it. If I had to choose my favorite, I already chose 2 of them. My favorites are the Gras Nikolsky and the Gras Spital Ski Charger Rotoli rifles from 1885. But what are your favorites of these experimental Gras modification rifles from the 1870s and 80s? Please tell me in the comments section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off.